A vast empire, spanning thousands of worlds, moving across the stars like an unstoppable force. It had conquered civilizations that once considered themselves mighty, crushed rebellions before they could rise, and rewritten the histories of species who had once called themselves free. Their war fleets could block out the skies of entire planets, and their armies were so vast that their mere presence was enough to make rulers kneel. They called themselves the Galactic Imperium, a civilization so ancient, so powerful that it had forgotten what it meant to lose. And then they found Earth. At first, it was nothing remarkable. A blue and green world spinning quietly in the outer rim of the Orion Arm, barely visible on the Imperium's star maps. The species that inhabited it, calling themselves humans, seemed no different from others the Imperium had encountered before. Primitive, undeveloped, and limited to a single star system. A people who had only just begun to stretch their reach beyond their homeworld, fumbling with crude spaceflight and slow-moving technology. It was almost laughable. The Imperium had absorbed hundreds of species just like them. The process was always the same. Introduce themselves as benevolent rulers, offer protection in exchange for loyalty, and if met with resistance, eradicate it. The humans would either submit, as so many others had before them, or they would be crushed. But then, something unexpected happened. The first Imperial envoy to Earth never returned. A single diplomatic vessel had been sent, following standard protocol, to make contact. It entered the Sol system under the banner of peace, its captain eager to claim another world for the Imperium. It was a simple mission: land, deliver the message, and wait for Earth's inevitable surrender. But days passed, then weeks, and no word came back. At first, High Command dismissed it as a technical failure. Perhaps the ship's communication array had been damaged, or it had been caught in an unfortunate accident. But protocol demanded answers. A second envoy was dispatched, this time a fully equipped diplomatic cruiser, with more advanced communications and better security. They, too, vanished without a trace. Now, the Imperium was watching. Something was wrong. There had never been a case where two envoys simply disappeared. The Imperium had encountered defiant civilizations before, of course, but even those had responded, even if only to reject their demands. Silence was unusual. Third envoy was sent, this time with an escort of warships. Their orders were simple: establish contact, investigate the disappearances, and, if necessary, subjugate. This time, a message was received. It was brief. Just a few words, laced with static, and then nothing. Imperial intelligence analyzed it for days, trying to decode what had happened. The only certainty was that the message had come from the envoy's ship. But it was incomplete, as if interrupted mid-transmission. And then there was the voice. It didn't belong to the crew. The Imperium was now certain. Earth was aware of them. And Earth did not want visitors. But why? What could possibly make a species at the edge of the galaxy, one that should be inferior in every way, so bold as to ignore the Imperium, to erase their envoys from existence without fear of retaliation? They needed answers. A stealth probe, the most advanced in the Imperium's arsenal, was dispatched. It was undetectable, invisible to all but the most advanced scanning technology. It drifted silently into orbit, its sensors mapping the planet below, recording everything. And what it found sent ripples of unease through the highest levels of the Imperium. This was no ordinary species. Humanity was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Their history was not one of submission, but of relentless conflict and survival. They had fought wars that reshaped their continents, built weapons that could reduce entire cities to dust, and had lived for thousands of years on a world that seemed determined to kill them. Where other species had evolved in harmony with their environments, humans had conquered theirs. Even worse, they had begun developing technology far beyond what their current level of advancement should allow. Their experiments in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and genetic engineering were concerning. The Imperium had seen this pattern before. Species that advanced too quickly often became unpredictable. And then, there were their warships. The humans had few, but they were terrifying in design. Unlike the sleek, elegant vessels of the Imperium, which were built for both war and diplomacy, the human warships had no such pretense. They were built for one thing: annihilation. Bristling with weaponry, reinforced with armor designed to withstand unimaginable damage, and, most concerning of all, equipped with experimental technologies the Imperium had barely begun to understand. It was clear. This was a species that had not been waiting for war. They had been preparing for it. And then, a single message was transmitted from Earth, broadcast in perfect Imperial dialect. It was not a greeting, not an invitation, not a threat. Stay away from Earth. No elaboration, no further communication, just 5 words, spoken with an eerie certainty that unsettled even the most hardened Imperium commanders. And it was then that the Imperium realized something even more disturbing. They were not dealing with a civilization desperate to avoid war. They were dealing with a species that had already decided how they would fight it. But the Imperium would not be deterred. Their arrogance had conquered 1,000 worlds. What was one more? And so they sent their first fleet, and Earth was waiting. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. The decision had been made. The Galactic Imperium, an empire spanning thousands of star systems, had faced defiance before. They had seen civilizations resist, rebellions flare up, and planets try to fight back. But in the end, resistance, always, crumbled beneath the weight of their might. Earth would be no different. To High Command, the situation was clear. The humans, despite their unusual silence, were still primitive. They had no true interstellar fleet, no planetary shields, no advanced warp capabilities. Their technology, while intriguing, was still incomplete. Anomalies rather than a real threat. Their stubbornness was a mere delay, a show of defiance before inevitable subjugation. And so, the Imperium did what it had always done. It sent a fleet. Not the full might of the Empire, of course. That would be unnecessary. Instead, a single strike force was deployed. 20 warships, including 3 dreadnoughts, supported by an armada of cruisers, frigates, and landing craft. It was more than enough to pacify a backwater world like Earth. After all, no species had ever survived an encounter with even a fraction of the Imperium's power. The fleet emerged from hyperspace just beyond the orbit of Pluto, their sleek hulls gleaming under the distant light of the sun. The commanding officer, High Admiral Varric, had no doubts about the mission ahead. He had conquered over 30 worlds, broken empires, shattered fleets, and executed kings. To him, Earth was just another name to be added to the long list of the Imperium's conquests. But as the fleet moved closer, something strange happened. There was no response. Normally, when the Imperium's warships entered a system, panic followed. Planets scrambled to surrender. Governments sent desperate messages begging for mercy. And even the most stubborn resistance forces at least acknowledged their arrival. But Earth did nothing. There were no distress calls, no emergency broadcasts, no last-minute pleas for diplomacy. It was as if they weren't there at all. Varric frowned. Expand scans. I want full system-wide telemetry. Locate their defenses, military installations, fleet movements, everything. His crew complied immediately. Sensor arrays hummed to life, scanning every inch of the solar system with precision. They expected to find the usual defenses: orbital, stations, missile platforms, and perhaps a fleet of outdated warships struggling to mount a response. Instead, what they found was unsettling. There were no orbital defenses, no planetary shields, no battle stations or strategically positioned outposts. Just silence. The only thing of interest was a small cluster of human-built satellites in orbit around their planet. Most of them ancient relics, clearly outdated, by Imperial standards. Even their space stations were unimpressive, scattered across low Earth orbit with no real military function. And yet, something didn't feel right. Varric had conquered enough worlds to recognize a trap when he saw one. Deploy. Recon drones, he ordered. I want a full analysis of their planetary surface. The drones launched, small and agile, designed for deep planetary surveillance. They streaked toward Earth, their advanced cloaking ensuring that they remained undetected. Within minutes, they were transmitting live feeds of the surface. The images confused the Imperium. The humans were calm. Cities bustled with activity. Traffic moved in organized lines. People gathered in groups, unaware or unbothered by the massive fleet now lurking at the edge of their solar system. Governments operated as if nothing was happening. There were no evacuations, no military deployments, no planetary defense, forces scrambling to respond. It was as if Earth had no idea they were here, or worse, as if they didn't care. Varick's second-in-command, a veteran officer named Terran, studied the data, his expression unreadable. "Sir, this isn't normal." Varick narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Terran hesitated. "We've encountered resistance before, but never like this. When species resist, they prepare. They go into hiding. They send warnings, even if they know they can't win. But the humans, they're just going about their lives." Varick considered this for a moment. Then he made his decision. "Prepare the ground forces. We'll take their capital first. Once we have their leaders, the rest will fall into line." It was a straightforward plan, one that had worked countless times before. Strike fast, overwhelm them, and force them to submit before they could organize. The Imperium's landing craft were some of the most advanced in the galaxy, capable of deploying entire regiments within minutes. Their shock troops were elite warriors, genetically enhanced and battle-hardened, designed to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. Within an hour the invasion was underway. Hundreds of landing craft broke through Earth's atmosphere, descending like a swarm of metallic locusts. Their target was clear: the human capital. Once the governing body was secured, the Imperium would broadcast its victory to the planet, and the rest of humanity would have no choice but to surrender. But the moment the first craft touched down, everything went wrong. The silence was broken. Without warning, electromagnetic pulses erupted across the landing zones, knocking out entire squadrons before they could even deploy their troops. The Imperium's communications scrambled, their sensors flickered, and for the first time in his long career, Varick felt something foreign creeping into his gut: doubt. Then the counterattack began. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Out of the shadows, hidden within their cities and landscapes, the humans struck with terrifying precision. They didn't fight like any species the Imperium had faced before. They weren't disorganized militias or panicked civilians. They fought with discipline, with purpose, with weapons far beyond what the Imperium's intelligence had predicted. Imperial dropships exploded mid-air, taken down by missile systems that had somehow gone undetected. Stealth drones swarmed enemy positions, only to be shot down before they could even engage. And the ground forces, they never stood a chance. Imperial soldiers were cut down before they could even raise their weapons. Human snipers picked them off one by one, striking through the gaps in their armor with terrifying accuracy. Entire squads vanished in a matter of minutes, their positions compromised before they could even call for reinforcements. Panic spread through the ranks. This is impossible," one officer stammered, as he watched an entire regiment disappear from the battlefield. They're outmaneuvering us." Varick's hands tightened into fists. He had underestimated them. Earth had not been caught off guard. Earth had been waiting. And now, for the first time in Imperium history, a conquest had turned into a war, and humanity had just begun to fight. The battlefield was chaos. What had been expected to be a swift and overwhelming planetary takeover had devolved into a brutal war zone. The Imperium's elite soldiers, genetically modified, highly trained, armed with cutting-edge technology, were being systematically eliminated by an enemy they had grossly underestimated. The humans weren't just resisting. They were hunting them. High Admiral Varick stood on the bridge of his command ship, his jaw clenched as he watched the incoming battlefield reports. The landing forces were being wiped out faster than they could deploy reinforcements. Entire battalions were vanishing. From the tactical display, their signals going dark one by one. "This doesn't make sense," one of the officers cried out. "We scanned their defenses. They had no planetary shields, no warships in orbit, nothing that should allow them to fight back. And yet they were fighting back, with ruthless efficiency." Varick's crimson eyes scanned the incoming reports, searching for an answer, searching for anything that would explain this disaster. The humans were clearly armed with advanced weaponry, but their true advantage lay elsewhere. They knew the battlefield. They knew where to strike, when to strike, and how to disappear before the Imperium could retaliate. It was as if they had been preparing for this day for years. The Imperium's ground troops had been trained to fight in open battlefields, to overwhelm their enemies with superior firepower, numbers, and brute force. But here, on this world, none of that mattered. Cities had become labyrinths of death. Urban environments were transformed into kill zones, with enemy snipers eliminating entire squads before they could even locate their attackers. Underground, bunkers allowed human strike teams to emerge, attack, and vanish back into the shadows without a trace. The forests, the mountains, the deserts, they were all traps. The moment Imperial forces set foot in unfamiliar terrain, they were met with a torrent of ambushes, explosives, and precision strikes. Even worse, their technology was failing them. Electromagnetic pulses weren't random, they were targeted. The humans had developed ways to disrupt the Imperium's weaponry, shutting down armor systems, disabling targeting computers, and scrambling communication channels. And then, there was the psychological warfare. The Imperium had never encountered anything like it before. Troops sent distress calls that were never answered. Entire platoons disappeared without a trace. Survivors were found days later, muttering nonsense, their minds shattered by whatever horrors they had witnessed. Some reported seeing phantom soldiers, shadows moving in the fog, figures that never made a sound but struck with inhuman precision. Others told stories of drones that made no noise, dropping payloads of weapons the Imperium had never seen before. Weapons that burned through their armor like it was paper. There were even reports of Imperium commanders receiving messages in their own language. Warnings, written in blood, carved into the walls of their command posts. Warnings that repeated the same phrase over and over. You were warned. Stay away from Earth. Varric's fist clenched as he read the latest reports. This was impossible. No species should have been able to counter the Imperium this effectively, and yet the humans had done more than counter them. They were winning. Sir, a tactical officer called out, panic in his voice. The 6th Fleet has lost contact with all deployed forces. All of them. Varric turned sharply. Explain. The officer's fingers trembled as he manipulated the holographic battlefield display. Where there had once been an organized assault force, now there was only silence, no transmissions, no distress calls, just nothing. Varric's eyes darkened. This wasn't just resistance, this was annihilation. He turned to his second-in-command. Order all remaining ground forces to retreat immediately. Pull them back to orbit and regroup. Terran hesitated. But sir, that will... I said, pull them. Back! Varric snapped, slamming his fist against the console. We can't win this battle with brute force. The humans are... A sudden, piercing alarm cut him off. A deep red glow bathed the command center as emergency sirens blared throughout the fleet. Officers scrambled to their stations, screens flashing critical alerts. Then, without warning, something hit them. The flagship shuddered violently, the impact nearly throwing Varric off his feet. A deafening explosion rocked the ship, followed by another. And another. Status report, Varric roared. The officer at the sensor station looked horrified. Sir, we're under attack. Varric's eyes widened. From where? There were no enemy warships in orbit, no planetary defenses capable of striking their fleet. How could this be happening? Then, the horrible realization struck him. The humans had been waiting for them to make this mistake. This wasn't just a counterattack, this was a trap. And now, the Imperium's fleet, the supposed invincible conquerors of the galaxy, had walked straight into it. Incoming projectiles, another officer screamed. They're coming from the planet. Varric's blood ran cold. Earth had no planetary defense systems, no orbital weapons, no fleets. At least, that's what they had thought. But the reality was far, far worse. Sir, those aren't missiles, the sensor officer stammered. They're... A blinding explosion tore through the viewport, and in that moment, Varric finally understood. The humans had spent centuries preparing for an invasion like this. They had hidden their true power, and now, as the Imperium's mighty warships exploded in orbit, it was clear. The humans weren't just defending their planet. They were teaching the Imperium a lesson. Stay away from Earth, or suffer the consequences. The Imperium had long believed in its absolute supremacy. They had crushed empires, shattered civilizations, and rewritten history to suit their dominance. Their fleets moved like celestial storms, bringing destruction to all who dared to defy them. Their warriors were bioengineered for war, tall, powerful, and armed with weapons that could level cities with a single strike. And yet, here, above this unremarkable blue world, the unthinkable was happening. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were dismantling the Imperium's forces with terrifying precision. From the command bridge of his warship, High Admiral Varric gripped the edges of the console, his talons digging into the reinforced metal as he struggled to process the catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. The fleet had been untouchable mere moments ago. Now it was in chaos. The capital ships trembled, their hulls cracking as unseen forces ripped through them. Fire and debris spewed into the void, bodies flung helplessly into the black abyss. The once disciplined formations of the Imperium's warships had collapsed into disorder as entire battle groups vanished in the blink of an eye. And the worst part? They still didn't know how it was happening. "Shields are failing across the fleet," an officer shouted, his voice shaking. "We're sustaining. We don't even know what kind of attacks these are." "Find out," Varric bellowed. "Where is it coming from? What weapons are they using? How are they doing this?" The sensor officer's fingers flew across the control panel, desperately scanning for answers. He froze as a new set of readings appeared before him. His breath hitched. "Sir." He turned, his face drained of color. "These are not conventional weapons." Varric's eyes narrowed. "Explain." The officer swallowed hard. "The energy signatures, they don't match anything in our records. They're coming from the planet's surface, but they're not missiles, railguns, or beam weapons. It's something else. Something we've never seen before." Varric's blood ran cold. Impossible. The humans had no spacefaring fleet to speak of. No intergalactic empire. No planetary defense network powerful enough to repel the Imperium. And yet, the undeniable truth was flashing on the screen in front of him. The Imperium was losing. A sudden, violent shockwave rattled the ship, and a blinding explosion flared through the viewport as yet another dreadnought was torn apart from the inside. Its shattered remains tumbled through the void, a wreckage of arrogance, consumed by the fury of a species that should have been primitive. "Sir," a new officer cried out, "we have another problem." Varric gritted his teeth. "What now?" "Our comms are being jammed," Varric turned sharply. "By the humans?" The officer hesitated, his hands trembling over the console. "No, sir. By our own fleet." Silence filled the bridge. A single dreadful realization dawned upon Varric. The humans had done something far more sinister than just destroying the Imperium's ships. They had infiltrated them. Across the fleet, ships began turning against one another. Weapons malfunctioned at critical moments. Shield systems collapsed without warning. Entire ships deactivated their own thrusters, leaving them vulnerable to enemy fire. And then came the horrifying transmissions. Varric's screen flickered. A new message appeared on every display, across every ship in the fleet. A single sentence. "You were warned. Stay away from Earth." The words weren't in the Imperium's language. They weren't even transmitted through normal radio frequencies. They appeared in the minds of every crew member. A psychic invasion, a mental assault. Some officers collapsed on the floor, screaming. Others stared blankly at the screen, their expressions vacant, their minds shattered by the sheer alien presence that had invaded their consciousness. Varric's vision blurred for a moment. He felt it, too. A presence, not one, but many. Thousands. Millions. A collective will, reaching across the stars, touching his mind, making him feel something he had never felt before. A warning. The humans weren't simply defending themselves. They were punishing. The Imperium. A deep, resonating whisper echoed in his thoughts, not in words, but in raw emotion. A single message. Run. And for the first time in his long, decorated career, High Admiral Varric felt fear. It wasn't just the warships exploding around him. It wasn't just the Imperium's technological failures, or their inability to comprehend what they were fighting. It was the realization. The terrifying, soul-crushing realization that the humans had been prepared for this, that the humans had been waiting, and now the Imperium was paying the price. "Sir!" a desperate voice called out. "We have incoming objects, fast-moving, high-energy signatures." Varric turned back to the display. It wasn't just coming from the planet anymore. Something was approaching from deep space, and it was moving too fast for any known technology in the galaxy. Something had answered the humans' call. Something even the Imperium had never seen before. The officer's voice cracked as he whispered, "Sir, what have we done?" Varric didn't have an answer, because for the first time in the Imperium's long history, it wasn't them that had brought the nightmare. It was Earth. And now, the real horror was coming. For all its might, the Imperium had never felt helpless. It had ruled over thousands of star systems, conquered empires, and subjugated species that once believed themselves unbreakable. No enemy had ever made them doubt their supremacy. No battle had ever been beyond their control, until now. High Admiral Varric stood frozen, his breath shallow, his eyes locked onto the sensor displays that now screamed warnings of an approaching force. Something was coming. Something not of the Imperium, not of any known power in the galaxy. The energy readings were unlike anything the fleet had ever encountered. The objects weren't moving through normal space. They were slipping through reality itself, folding the void in ways that defied logic. "These readings," a trembling officer whispered. "Sir, this isn't possible." Varric didn't reply, because deep down, he knew. The humans had sent a warning, and the Imperium had ignored it. Now the true consequence was upon them. A piercing alarm blared across the bridge, its shrill tone shaking Varric from his trance. "They've arrived!" someone shouted. Varric snapped his head up, eyes scanning the viewport just as space itself seemed to tear apart. The void, once empty, cold, and indifferent, was now alive with blinding light and shadow. Rifts, jagged and unnatural, opened like bleeding wounds in space. And from those tears, they emerged. Massive vessels, black as the abyss, yet shimmering with an eerie, shifting glow. Their forms weren't rigid like the Imperium's warships. They were fluid, amorphous, ever-changing, as if they existed in multiple realities at once. They weren't just ships, they were entities, and they were here for the Imperium. Varric clenched his jaw. Defensive formations, now. The fleet scrambled, ships attempting to reorganize, to set up firing positions. But before a single order could be completed, the first attack came. It was not a missile, not a laser, not any kind of physical weapon the Imperium understood. It was a wave, a pulse, of unseen energy that passed through the ships like a silent storm. There was no explosion, no fire, and yet, entire vessels ceased to function. "Sir, our battlecruisers, they're just shutting down." Varric's breath hitched. "Explain." The officer's fingers flew across the control panel. "They're not damaged, but their systems are dead. Every core, every power source, every circuit, just gone." Varric's blood ran cold. What kind of weapon did this? Another pulse surged through the fleet, and this time the effects were worse. The shields failed on half the remaining ships. Weapons refused to fire. Engines stopped responding. The fleet, one of the most powerful armadas in the galaxy, was being unmade. And then, the voices came. Not through the comms, not through sound. They came directly into their minds. "You were warned." The words echoed inside Varric's skull, heavy and absolute. "You were warned." The bridge crew screamed, some collapsing as the voices burrowed into their thoughts. Others clutched their heads, their eyes wide with terror. And then, the Imperium's worst nightmare unfolded. The ships that had gone silent turned against them. Weapons came back online, but not under Imperium control. Dreadnoughts turned their turrets inward. Destroyers unleashed hell upon their own formations. Imperial soldiers aboard the vessels found themselves locked out of their own systems, unable to stop their ships from betraying their comrades. "Sir!" a voice choked out. "We're being fired upon by our own fleet." Varric felt his heart pound against his ribs. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was annihilation. He turned to his officers, but most were either unconscious or in shock. Only a handful remained functional, their faces pale with horror. Varric had to act. "Open a wide-frequency channel," he barked. "Sir, now!" The officer obeyed, hands shaking as the comms flickered to life. Varric took a breath, one that felt like his last. "This is High Admiral Varric of the Imperium," he said, voice steady despite the chaos. "We acknowledge your warning. We surrender." Silence. The ships, the entities, stopped. The Imperium's own fleet fell still. For a moment, it was as if the galaxy held its breath. Then, a final message echoed in Varric's mind. "Leave. Never return." And then the nightmare ended. The strange entities vanished. Their ships, if they could even be called that, slipped back into the void, their forms dissolving into the darkness from which they came. The Imperium's surviving vessels, now crippled and barely functional, were left, adrift in space, and Earth, untouched, protected by something far greater than any empire. Varric sank into his chair, his hands trembling. The Imperium had always believed itself to be the apex of civilization, the unchallenged rulers of the cosmos. But here, at the edge of the void, above this tiny blue world, they had learned a terrifying truth. Earth wasn't weak, it wasn't primitive, and it wasn't alone. The once mighty Imperial fleet now drifted, broken, powerless, and at the mercy of an unseen force that had defied all logic. Where there had been order, there was now chaos. Where there had been certainty, there was now fear. And where the Imperium had once looked upon humanity as an insignificant footnote in galactic history, they now saw something beyond comprehension. High Admiral Varric could still hear the words echoing in his skull. "Leave! Never return!" The voice hadn't come from a transmission. It hadn't been carried by sound or light. It had been something else, a force that had bypassed every defense, every firewall, every barrier, and spoken directly to their minds. No species in the galaxy could do this. No empire had ever wielded power like this, and yet humanity had, or worse, something had done it for them. Varric sat slumped in his command chair, hands trembling against the cold metal armrests. His officers were still recovering, their faces pale, eyes hollow, their breathing ragged as they tried and failed to process what had happened. The Imperium's finest fleet had just been rendered helpless without a single shot being fired. It was unthinkable, impossible, and yet— "Sir, we have incoming transmissions," a shaken comms officer whispered. Varric's fingers clenched. "From Earth?" The officer gulped. "No, sir. From other Imperium ships. The survivors." Varric exhaled. The survivors. How many? His mind screamed for a damage report, but he was afraid to ask, afraid of the answer. The battle, if it could even be called that, had lasted mere minutes. The humans hadn't needed hours or even seconds to dismantle an entire Imperial fleet. And if they could do this to a fleet of dreadnoughts, destroyers, and battlecruisers, what could they do to the Imperium itself? A cold sweat ran down Varric's back. "Patch them through," he said, voice hoarse. The comms flickered to life, and a wave of frantic voices exploded through the bridge. "Our systems are locked. We can't move. The primary reactor is unresponsive. By the stars, what did they do to us?" Panic. Desperation. Varric had never heard his people sound like this. The Imperium's officers and captains were trained for war. They had seen planetary bombardments, star system invasions, entire civilizations burned to cinders under the might of Imperial weaponry. They were conquerors. But now, they sounded like frightened children. Varric cut through the noise. "This is Admiral Varric. All ships, report status immediately." One by one, voices crackled through the comms, and what he heard only made the weight in his chest grow heavier. Half the fleet was gone, either obliterated by friendly fire or completely disappeared into the void. No wreckage, no debris, just vanished. Another third of the fleet was crippled. Their systems were non-functional, weapons offline, engines dead, as if their ships had been turned into lifeless husks. The remaining vessels, though technically operational, refused to respond to commands. Their AI systems had been overwritten, controls locked, as if something or someone had hijacked them. Varric clenched his fists. What kind of power is this? The Imperium had fought against some of the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy. They had battled enemies that wielded planet-killing weapons, gravity-warping cannons, and fleets that stretched across entire star systems. But not a single empire, not a single species, had ever done what the humans had just done. And that was the most terrifying part. The Imperium had spent centuries enforcing its dominance over the stars. And now, for the first time, they had encountered something that could not only resist them, but completely overpower them. A fresh transmission came through, cutting into the silence of the bridge. High Admiral Varric, a new voice spoke. It was calm, collected, human. Varric stiffened. I am listening. There was a pause. Then, you were warned. Varric felt his breath catch. Not this again. The same words, the same tone, the same unshakable certainty. But this time, the voice continued. Your empire believes it can take whatever it wants, that it can bend the galaxy to its will, that it can march across the stars unchallenged. The words were not shouted. They were not filled with anger or malice, and yet they weighed more than any threat Varric had ever heard. You were given a chance, the voice said, to leave this world in peace. You chose war. Varric's jaw tightened. We never fired upon you. Did you need to? A deep silence fell across the bridge. The human's voice did not waver. You came here with an armada, they continued. You came here with warships capable of erasing civilizations. You came here believing yourselves invincible, and now? Varric closed his eyes. And now, they had lost. We will not ask again, the voice said. A quiet rumble echoed through the hull. At first, Varric thought it was the engines reactivating, until he looked at the viewports. The stars were moving. No, the fleet was moving. But not by their own power. Something was pulling them away from Earth. One by one, the crippled Imperial ships, battlecruisers, dreadnoughts, even those that had lost power entirely, were being dragged across space by an unseen force. Varric stared, wide-eyed, as his entire fleet was pushed back, further, beyond the system's edge, and when they reached the very edge of the solar system, they stopped. Varric swallowed. The human's voice returned, but now it was different, darker, final. This is your last chance. The temperature on the bridge seemed to drop. Set foot in this system again, and there will be nothing left of your empire but whispers in the void. The transmission cut, and just like that, it was over. No more warnings. No more threats. The Imperium, once the mightiest force in the galaxy, had been cast out. Varric felt the weight of it settle upon his shoulders. Humanity had warned them. The Imperium had not listened, and now, they had learned the price of arrogance. The fleet was adrift, silent, powerless, and utterly defeated. The stars outside the viewport seemed colder now. The vastness of space, once a domain the Imperium had dominated without question, now felt like an endless abyss of uncertainty. High Admiral Varric sat motionless in his command chair, the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions pressing down on him. The Imperium had lost wars before, but never like this. Never without a single shot fired. Never without a clear enemy to fight. His officers were in a state of quiet shock, their minds still struggling to process what had happened. Some sat staring at their flickering consoles, waiting for something, anything, to return to normal. Others simply stared at their hands, as if questioning whether they were still in control of themselves, or if they too had been bent by the unseen force that had rendered their fleet helpless. For centuries, the Imperium had prided itself on its unstoppable conquest. They had subjugated entire civilizations. They had crushed fleets that had dared to resist them. They had rewritten the histories of weaker species, shaping the galaxy according to their will. And yet, here they were, defeated, humbled, exiled, and worst of all, they didn't even know how. Varric took a slow, steady breath, forcing himself to speak. "Status report," a hesitant voice responded, cutting through the eerie quiet of the bridge. "Sir, we're being held in place by an unknown force. Our systems are slowly coming back online, but navigation controls remain unresponsive." Varric frowned. "Weapons?" A long pause. "Disabled. Every ship in the fleet is locked out of its targeting systems. It's as if our weapons don't exist." Varric closed his eyes. It wasn't just that they had been pushed away from Earth. It was worse. Humanity, or whatever force protected them, had not merely defeated the Imperium. They had done something far more terrifying. They had rendered the greatest military power in the galaxy irrelevant. A chill ran through him. "Are we receiving any transmissions?" The comms officer hesitated. "Not from Earth, sir, but there are signals coming from the outer colonies. The Imperium is requesting a status update." Varric grimaced. Of course, back in the heart of the Empire, no one knew what had happened yet. The governors, the military commanders, the ruling aristocracy, they were still waiting for news of Earth's conquest. They still believed in the illusion that the Imperium was untouchable. That illusion was now dead. Varric exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temple. The weight of the moment was crushing. How could he explain this? How could he make them understand? Would the High Council believe him if he told them that an entire fleet, one of the largest armadas ever assembled, had been repelled without a single shot fired? Would they accept that something beyond their comprehension had intervened? Or would they refuse to believe it, dismissing his words as the ramblings of a man who had failed his mission? He could already hear the voices in his mind. The great Admiral Varric, failed by fear, defeated by ghosts. His career, his legacy, would be destroyed. And yet, none of that mattered anymore, because something far more terrifying had been revealed. The Imperium was not the apex of the galaxy. They had always believed that they were the dominant species, that their power was absolute, their fleets unmatched, their technology superior. But now, they had seen what lay beyond their arrogance, and the truth was staggering. Humanity had not begged for mercy. They had not fought desperately, nor had they pleaded for survival. They had warned the Imperium, and when that warning was ignored, they had simply removed them, effortlessly, as if the greatest fleet in the galaxy had been nothing more than an annoyance. A whisper of unease ran through the bridge crew. Even those who had spent their lives steeped in Imperial propaganda, the belief in their empire's absolute power, now carried an unspoken fear in their eyes. Varric could feel it. The question none of them dared to ask: if the humans could do this to us, what else are they capable of? Silence stretched across the bridge. And then, a sound. A low hum. The lights flickered. The air itself seemed to tremble, as if space had bent around them once more. And then, the fleet moved. Not by their own engines, not by their own command. Something unseen, something unfathomable was pulling them away from Earth. Beyond the system. Beyond the boundaries of human space. And when they reached the outermost edge of the system, they stopped. It was then, only then, that Varric realized what had happened. They hadn't just been pushed away. They had been exiled. No matter how many ships they sent, no matter how many fleets they mustered, the Imperium would never touch Earth again. And then, as if to solidify that final, inescapable truth, a final transmission came through. No visual, just a single sentence, a whisper of warning. "This is not a negotiation. Stay away from Earth." And then, silence. No more words, no more threats, nothing. The transmission cut off as abruptly as it had begun. Varric stared at the empty screen, his mind racing. He could feel it. The galaxy had just changed. The Imperium had ruled the stars for thousands of years. They had crushed rebellions, conquered worlds, and erased entire species from history. And yet, they had just been told where their power ended. For the first time in Imperial history, there was a line they could not cross. Not because of treaties, not because of politics, but because some force beyond their understanding had decided it would be so. And if they ever dared to test that limit again, there would be no Imperium left to tell the story. Varric slowly exhaled. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he gave the order. Turn the fleet around. We return to the Empire. The officers hesitated. Some looked like they wanted to protest. Others looked relieved, but in the end, they obeyed. One by one, the remaining ships powered up their engines and turned away from the forbidden world. The humans had warned them. They had refused to listen, and now they knew the truth. Earth was not a prize to be claimed. It was not a planet to be conquered. It was a place that even the mightiest empire in the galaxy dared not touch, because whatever lurked there had made its decision. Stay away from Earth, and the Imperium, for the first time in its history, obeyed.